You're watching Access Minnesota. Here's Jim Dubois.
Many of us have come to rely on the free online encyclopedia, Wikipedia. The site claims that anyone can contribute and edit content, but a study finds that the wiki world is less than friendly towards women. John Riedel is a professor of computer science and engineering in the College of Science and Engineering at the University of Minnesota, and Tony Lamb is a PhD candidate in the department. Professor Riedel, Tony, welcome to Access Minnesota. The online encyclopedia Wikipedia is a free encyclopedia that welcomes contributions and edits from everyone. But your research uncovered significant differences between the way men and women contributors are treated on Wikipedia. Tell us more about those findings.
So we did a study of Wikipedia, and we found that a large gender gap exists amongst the editors. We found that in 2009, 16% of the new editors coming to Wikipedia were female. And we found that the gender gap appears to be much deeper than that. We found that those 16% of females only did 9% of the edits, of all the edits done by editors joining during 2009. And so from that, it looks like females are leaving Wikipedia sooner than males. They're doing less work, and that suggests that there's kind of a bias against them in the encyclopedia.
So you were sensing a hostility towards women in the Wikipedia community. Is that a fair assessment?
Well, that's the concern. Our data don't let us say for sure why it is that women are not staying in Wikipedia. But the thing that really brings me concern is, if you look at it, Wikipedia has become a cultural resource. It's the place that everybody goes to first to get information on almost anything. And of course, everybody is happy to tell you that you shouldn't rely on it as your only research resource. But even in our research group, if we hear of a new idea, the first place we'll look is Wikipedia, and then we'll follow up by reading some of the secondary resources. So the concern is, if for whatever reason women are being driven away from Wikipedia in much higher numbers than men, then that's creating this fundamental bias in one of our culturally most important information resources. And we don't know what implications that will have downstream, but its potential, it could have very powerful implications if one voice is being silenced.
What kind of impact does this apparent gender bias have on the site's content?
So we did a couple different analyses of disparities between topics that are of particular interest to males and topics that are of particular interest to females in Wikipedia. In one study, we looked at the Wikipedia articles that females and males tended to be concentrated in with their editing behavior. And there we found that the articles that have a higher concentration of female editors are of inferior quality. They're shorter than the articles that have more male editors in them. In the second analysis we did, we looked at Wikipedia articles about movies, and we have access to a data source that lets us know how a movie's audience is split between the genders. So from that, we're able to tell whether a movie has a higher female audience or a higher male audience. And using that data, we compared the Wikipedia articles about movies that are more female-oriented and movies that are more male-oriented. And there we found a similar result. The articles about movies that have higher female audiences are just lower in quality than their male counterparts.
Why do you think this gender gap exists? Is this something unique to Wikipedia, or is it endemic to the computing and information technology fields?
Well, that's the interesting thing, is that in computer science as a discipline, there is a strong gender gap against women. But over the last decade, there's been a dramatic shift in the number of women who are interested in using technologies like Wikipedia, so that now there's more than half females on things like Facebook, Twitter, email, almost any use of computer technology for communicating and interacting with other people. There are more women than men. And so you have this really confusing thing. Why on Wikipedia over the past 5 years has there been no change in this really, really low rate of participation, when in almost every other domain on the internet we see women just embracing it and becoming active participants? We don't know from our data exactly why it is, what it is that's causing this, but we do know from our data that whatever the cause is, it's creating some real imbalances in coverage in Wikipedia.
Given what you've uncovered in your research, how do you change the culture in the Wikipedia community to make it more inclusive for women?
Yes, that's a challenge. Now, one of the pieces of good news here is that the Wikimedia Foundation, the nonprofit foundation that runs Wikipedia, is aware of these problems and they're very interested in them. In fact, is it the CEO, Sue?
Sue Gardner. I think she's the director of the Wikimedia Foundation.
The director?
Yeah.
So in fact, Sue Gardner, the director of the Wikimedia Foundation, is a woman and is very concerned about the fact that Wikipedia, one of the properties that they support, is not very friendly towards women. And she's looking at ways, how can we change this culture? How can we make it a culture that's more welcoming? I haven't heard very many good ideas about specifics of what to do. And one of the reasons for that is kind of fundamental to the way Wikipedia works, which is Wikipedia is a culture in which the volunteers do everything. So literally the policies that are set by Wikipedia are not set by someone who's paid to set policies. They're set by this community of volunteers discussing and arguing and coming to a consensus. So you have this really fascinating situation where the power of Wikipedia, the thing that makes it so great, is that it's all done by individuals, just each contributing their own opinions and their own feelings. But that now means that once the snowballs started rolling down the hill and you have 84% males in that community, it's going to be very hard to make that a culture that's more welcoming to females.
Given your research findings, how optimistic are you that Wikipedia can overcome its gender gap issues?
One of the things that I think is very interesting in our data is that we found that there are very few women who become heavy editors of Wikipedia, but there are some. And of the women who become heavy editors of Wikipedia, they are much more likely than even the heaviest editors who are male to become administrators. So it doesn't seem to me like there's a flaw in something about women in our culture that makes them ineffective at contributing to Wikipedia. It feels to me like women who somehow overcome these barriers and really become active contributors have a pathway to success. They can then become very effective and very successful in Wikipedia. So it feels to me like we're on the one hand in this situation where we've got a snowball rolling down the hill, accumulating more and more mass, by which I mean more males, and it's going to be hard to overcome that. But on the other hand, I don't believe that there are any fundamental reasons for Wikipedia to be like that. I think if I could wave my magic wand right now and make Wikipedia, like Facebook, like Twitter, be a gender-balanced internet community, then I think it would be stable as a gender-balanced community. Unfortunately, I think it's also stable as a male-balanced community. And so the question is, what can we do to shift that balance point to get it back to the gender-balanced community?
John Riedel is a professor of computer science and engineering at the University of Minnesota, and Tony Lamb is a PhD candidate in the department. Professor Riedel, Tony, thanks so much for joining us on Access Minnesota.
Well, thank you for the conversation.
Thank you.
When Access Minnesota returns, a look at the modern feminist movement.
Access Minnesota will return after these messages.